For Don West, Michael Lanos, HLN. You had to cross-examine Rachel Gentel and Dr. Bao. Did you relish the challenge, or was it a nightmare?
No question it was a challenge. What I think we needed to establish with Ms. Gentel, while it took several hours to accomplish, and there were those challenges within that itself, we showed through her testimony when the phone call, the second to last phone call ended with Trayvon Martin. What was it, 7/12/48, something like that, 7/11/48. And when the next one started, and then when the event itself occurred. Through that testimony, corroborated by the phone records, we could show, as Mr. O'Meara clearly pointed out in closing, there were 4 minutes. There were 4 minutes in between the time when Trayvon Martin ran off until he reappeared and the confrontation with George Zimmerman occurred. As well, the circumstances under which Ms. Gentel was asked to answer questions were extraordinarily challenging for her. My goodness, she wanted to be left alone. She didn't volunteer anything until she was pulled out of this. And the first interview she gave was with the family lawyer, with the family present on the other end of the phone. It was an interview made for TV, not for law enforcement, that was then followed by an interview with the state attorney's office on April 2nd under the most extraordinary circumstances. It took place in Ms. Fulton's living room with Ms. Fulton sitting next to Ms. Gentel. That set the stage for the witness herself saying, I was uncomfortable. I changed my testimony to really to accommodate the feelings of Ms. Fulton. That was the setting for all of this. Plus, as Mr. O'Meara pointed out, she really didn't want to be there. Was that a challenge? Of course it was. But I think ultimately, when you distill it to its important parts, that we did accomplish ultimately what we wanted. As to Dr. Bao, did you hear Dr. DeMaio's testimony? Much of my cross-examination of Dr. Bao was to set the stage for that, indicating where they would clearly disagree, trying to identify why and how they would disagree, and then offering, I think, perhaps the foremost expert in the country on the very issue we had in our case.
Hi, Valerie Boy, Fox 35 News. 2 questions. Do you think the judge was fair or unfair to you? And my other question is, do you think this verdict will hurt race relations?
Judge Nelson runs her courtroom very well, and she moved this case along at a pace that I appreciated. Obviously, we were asking for motions to continue along the way, not because of her timeline as much as because the state's concerns over discovery. So it turns out we were able to accomplish what we needed to in the time she gave us. Within the context of the courtroom herself, as I mentioned a couple of times, I appreciate that she reminds me when I do things like speaking objections or somehow no comes out of my mouth. And that's okay. She needs to run a strict courtroom. And I think that she did. So I sort of appreciate that. And I'm okay with that. We certainly had some concerns over the rulings as they occurred, but we respect them as the rulings they are. You had a second part to that?
Do you think this verdict will affect race relations?
I kept saying a year ago that I really hope that they don't. I kept suggesting to Mr. Crump on 3 separate occasions that we not suggest that this is a civil rights case of the century, because it's just not. It was a self-defense case. Did it bring to the forefront the conversation that young black males are treated a certain way in the criminal justice system? Absolutely. Is that positive? Absolutely. Do we need to have that conversation? Absolutely. However, if portending that conversation on top of the Zimmerman verdict is going to affect our ability to have that conversation, shame on them, because that conversation needs to be had. And now it may not be had because we have sort of artificially separated the 2 camps, if you will, over this verdict. This verdict still has nothing to do with civil rights. Civil rights needs to be talked about, but not in the context of the George Zimmerman verdict.
George Howell with CNN. This question specifically to you, Mr. West. As far as the relationship with the judge, the back and forth, can you talk to us just a bit about that? Do you feel that you were getting fair treatment? And a second question that's similar to both of you. What do you say regarding the tension? What do you tell people who've dug in on one side or the other?
You know, that's been such a challenge for me. Obviously, while I've tried a number of cases over the last 33 years or so, a number of them with extremely high stakes, death penalty cases. Nothing, of course, like this with the media attention. Nothing that had the case tried over and over and over again in the media. Nothing where the media was accused of such irresponsibility early on, frankly, being swept along with this narrative that's simply been shown not to be true. To me, as a trial lawyer, that was an incredible distraction, because I like to, in fact, the only place I can try a case is in the courtroom, and I think we did that, so I don't know how to respond.
Yes.
Jackie Goddard for the Times of London and the Daily Beast. You mentioned about George wanting to get his life back. There's one person who's not going to. Have you got any words for Trayvon Martin's family?
They suffered a tragedy. I've acknowledged that to the family on 3 previous occasions. Nothing can bring back Trayvon Martin. Every time any life is lost, particularly a young life, it's a tragedy. We hear about it in car accidents. We hear about it with cancer. I lost a 13-year-old niece to cancer. We hear about it constantly, and it's always a tragedy. But I'm not going to shy away from the fact that I think that the evidence supported that George Zimmerman did nothing wrong, and that he was battered and beaten by a 17-year-old who, for whatever reason, and we won't know, thought that he had to lash out and attack violently. And it turned out that all of the forensic evidence supports that. None of it supports that George was ever the aggressor, certainly not legally, and I don't believe morally. So did that end up leading to the tragic loss of life? Yes. Could it have been avoided? Yes. When it really came down to it, 45 seconds before the gunshot, when George was getting battered, I still believe that that decision was in Trayvon Martin's hands more than my client's. And as I mentioned, they get my greatest sympathies for their tragic loss of their son. No one should ever have to suffer losing a child, ever. But it happens much more than we're willing to acknowledge sometimes, or that we want to admit. This is a tragedy like many other loss of children. It's just not one that George was responsible for.
Ty Wright, Valencia Voice. When the jury asked for clarification on the instructions regarding manslaughter, was there any nervousness between you guys and George that he would be facing the lesser charges?
My understanding was that they were confused by a confusing jury instruction. I said to the judge, Mr. West first argued one day, and before I started my closing the next day, that the manslaughter instruction is very confusing. I don't want to get into the legal part of it, and I know you don't, but if you look at it, justifiable homicide is identified within manslaughter, excusable homicide is identified within manslaughter, and somewhere separate is justifiable use of deadly force. If you try and read those, they are logically inconsistent, but not legally inconsistent. And I think that jury, as smart as they are, because they were thinking, looked at it and said, why are you telling us about excusable homicide? It's just that we had to, even though it had no application to the facts of this case. So, sure.
Hi. Hi. Yami Shalsunder with USA Today. Don West, you said that I am thrilled that this jury kept this tragedy from becoming a travesty. Can you talk about what the tragedy you're talking about? We talked about civil rights issues here, people not falsely or wrongly linking it to race. Could you just tell me a little bit more what you mean by that tragedy into a travesty?
The tragedy is the loss of Trayvon Martin's life in every respect. Regardless of what he was doing or immediately what led up to it, it's a tragic loss of life. It not only will impact, of course, Trayvon Martin's family and all those that knew him forever and ever. This event itself also impacts George Zimmerman forever and ever and ever. This is something no one gets over. There's no winners here. There's no monsters here. That's the tragedy. The travesty, it would have been a travesty of justice had George Zimmerman been convicted. That's the travesty.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate the time. I think that was, someone said it was the last question, so.
Just very, please. Iris Delgado with Univision National Network. From your private conversations with George Zimmerman, what was the most compelling statement from George Zimmerman that made you believe in his innocence?
There's not just one, but if you really want to look at the statements, the first opportunity that he could say something about this case, he said, "I was screaming out for help and nobody came." When Officer Serino challenged him and said, "I think there may be a video of this," he said, "Thank God." I dismiss with disgust the state's suggestion that he was some cop wannabe savant who knew that he could take on that bluff. I think that really speaks to what George was going through that night and how he presented it. So if you want to look for some insight from him, that was it.
Did he ever cry to you?
I'm sorry?
Did he ever cry to you, show you emotions?
Absolutely. 16 months of being, some people called him the most hated man in America for having defended his own life only after getting beat for 45 seconds. And then a man who believes in the system, whose dad was a judge, who maybe wanted to be a cop or a prosecutor, then gets a system. 2 systems went against George Zimmerman that he can't understand. You guys, the media, he was like a patient in an operating table where mad scientists were committing experiments on him and he had no anesthesia. He didn't know why he was turned in to this monster, but quite honestly, you guys had a lot to do with it. You just did, because you took a story that was fed to you and you ran with it and you ran right over him. And that was horrid to him. Then he comes into a system that he trusts. Let's not forget, 6 voluntary statements, voluntary surrender. And he believes in a system that he really wanted to be part of, right? And then he gets prosecutors that charge him with a crime they could never, ever prove. It's not like they didn't lose evidence along the way, right? So I don't think anyone would argue with me in this room that they had evidence of second-degree murder. This in-your-heart kind of stuff, that's not what we're supposed to do, and it's not what they're supposed to do. So those 2 systems failed him.
Thank you.
Thanks.